bit of a late start, 5 minutes. Do apologize for that. Well, normally we would be going 5 hours earlier. I delayed the start of this live stream because I was driving today back from New York City, had a beautiful wedding. I was fortunate enough to attend yesterday, last evening in Brooklyn. Also caught up with some great friends of mine in the New York City metro area. So very glad to have had that opportunity over the weekend and now to get to speak to you for, I don't know, half hour, 45 minutes, an hour this afternoon. And if you want to join me, I know a couple folks were waiting to speak to me, or at least to see this live stream when it went live. So now is an opportunity. Call in at any time, 240-363-7190. You see the phone number there on your screen. And I would note that I call this a Monday free for all in when I was promoting it. So that means really call anytime about anything. I did want to not apologize, but note that I understand perhaps the biggest story is the indictment of Trump. We did talk about this a little bit on Friday, did bring it up. And I have been very critical in the past of both the prosecutions that we know of. Well, there's one in New York with a lot of different counts for the Stormy Daniels payoff. I'm critical of that prosecution. I did a show with I guess she's a podcaster. Sasha Stone also has a Substack, and she is a Trump supporter. I am not, but I join her in her criticism of that prosecution. But where I part company with many of the those who have criticized the various three impeachments of Trump and now the New York State case against him, where I part company is with this indictment. I think it's justified, clearly. I mean, he held those documents and he requested them and he refused to present them. He refused to produce them. So he hid them. He stiffed the FBI. Stupid, does make sense to me. Don't understand why he would do it. That's very problematic in my book. It justifies the prosecution now, justifies the indictment now. Also, I did want to discuss, and I will later this week, but I do want to let you know that this is going to come up, the report that there maybe have been an offer to Trump that if he withdrew from the presidential race next year, if he announced that he was not going to run, that maybe the charges would be withdrawn. And he said, no, that's not going to happen. I'm running, period. There's been a question, would any prosecutor offer that as a potential plea bargain, right? Offered a plea bargain in return for a promise not to run, that the charges would be dropped or at least dismissed until, without prejudice, until after the 2024 campaign. Is that plausible? And I think it is plausible. I mean, if the prosecution's main goal here is to prevent somebody who illegally held on to classified material and say, well, if you do something like that, you shouldn't be president, which I think is understandable, then yes, I think that is a reasonable plea to offer. Some might say, well, that's the American public's decision, right? Whether they want Trump to be president again. And I hear you, but this is a serious charge, and it's something a president should not do. And if assuming he did it, and it seems like he did, so I get it. I get the FBI offering that plea, or the prosecution, Merrick Garland, the Justice Department offering that plea. I think Merrick Garland has to date acted responsibly, resisted pressure to charge Trump for what happened on January 6th. I don't think the case was a strong case, that Trump was plotting a violent overthrow of the U.S. government. I mean, there was a case. It was a weak one. You shouldn't bring a case unless you're pretty sure you're going to win it. So that's, he showed responsibility. I think it was responsible of Merrick Garland not to charge Trump for the payout to Stormy Daniels. I don't think it's responsible of the New York State government to do that, the New York State prosecutor to do that, or the New York City prosecutor, DA, whoever it is who's bringing that charge. I don't think that's responsible. prosecution. This seems to me responsible. I think Merrick Garland actually has more credibility now because he hasn't in the past, despite political pressure, charged the president criminally. We'll see what happens. Obviously, we'll follow that case, and I'll talk about it more later on in the week. What really kind of triggered my topic for today's call, and by the way, it is a Monday free-for-all, so please call in 240-363-7190. What triggered this particular topic was a question that was asked me by somebody over the weekend, which was, well, you're always saying that you can't trust the New York Times and you can't trust the Washington Post and you can't trust MSNBC or CNN. So why should I trust you? Why are you more trustworthy? Is your opinion more credible? Who are the people you believe? Who are the people that you find more credible? And I thought that was a really good and a very, very challenging question. And then I read what one of the Facebook posters at Halitics, and by the way, please join Halitics on Facebook if you haven't yet done so, and click subscribe here on this video if you're watching it. By the way, I lost a subscriber last week. I think it was because I posted a video of Trump in which I complimented what Trump had to say. I said that's the right thing to say. It was about Ukraine. I think I may have lost a subscriber because of that. May have been another reason. Got a subscriber back. Would love to see the numbers continue to rise. So please click subscribe. I thought this was a really interesting back and forth on Halitics on Facebook, and this is what I want to have with you. So I posted from The Intercept an article that was critical of Jamie Raskin, representative from the great state of Maryland, and talk show host Rachel Maddow for their full-throated support of the war in Ukraine. And I said their support of that war, their unwillingness to brook any dissent, any criticism of it, to respond to those who criticized them for supporting what could become World War III, means they pose a very significant danger to our survival, just as Taylor Greene and Sean Hannity do. And I added this quote, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravening wolves." And that's how I see them, Maddow with the $10 million she gets a year from, or maybe it's more now, from MSNBC. So like Hannity, just saying whatever her bosses want her to say in return for her 30 pieces of silver. And Raskin going to speak at a conference hosted by and sponsored by two manufacturers of weaponry, two of the merchants of death, and speaking, in complete support of the war that's earning them billions and costing to date hundreds of thousands of lives and destroying Eastern Europe. So I see no way to distinguish those evils that they're doing from many of the evils that Sean Hannity has done, and perhaps to a lesser degree, Taylor Greene. So in response to my post, I got a response from a Halitics poster, which I really appreciate, although it was a bit snarky. "Looking for truth, you can rely on Rachel." In other words, completely rejecting what I had to say. And then I responded snarkily myself, and I'm really working on not being a master of snark. It really doesn't help us get to a better place. It really doesn't. It doesn't help us, figure out solutions to our problems. It only makes things worse, in my view. My response was, "She is still lying to you about Russiagate. Why doesn't that anger you?" And frankly, I do wonder. I mean, that's not a question that's being asked facetiously or sarcastically. I really do wonder why. I really don't understand why people find the Rachel Maddows of this world, and frankly, the Jamie Raskins of the world, credible or people that we should admire or we should praise. I only support politicians to the extent that they do what I want them to do. If they don't do what I want them to do, I ain't for them. I'm only for them to the extent they're on my side as I see it. So I don't understand people who kind of decide based on what the hosts tell them. I decide if I like a host based on what they tell me, and if it's what I personally believe. I don't change my opinions based on what, rarely. But that goes to that again question. Well, I'm saying to this poster, you shouldn't support Maddow. And the response is, well, then who should we rely on? You. And this is exactly the conversation I mentioned I had with someone over the weekend. When I said you can't trust MSNBC, you can't trust CNN, you can't trust New York Times, you can't trust Washington Post. And the question is, well, then who can we trust, and why should we trust you? And why should we trust whatever sources you rely on? And those are, well, here's what I have to say to that. And let me get this up. So here we go. Who should we rely on? Fox News and its ilk? In other words, if you're not going to believe the New York Times, should we believe in Fox? Should we believe in any news agency that normalizes anti-Semitism, supports Trump, wants to cut taxes for billionaires and large corporations, wants to eliminate Social Security and Medicare, wants to eliminate women's right to choose, eliminate LGBTQ rights? All right, and my response is we should rely on neither. Both are proven liars. And then, okay, who can you trust? Now, it's interesting because I don't think the opinions that you necessarily read in an outlet, even if you very, very strongly disagree with their opinions, I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. In other words, the Wall Street Journal's opinion page, I find pretty much abhorrent, noxious. It's the epitome of neoliberalism, of deference to the corporate state. That said, I am willing to credit and to trust and verify reports in their news section. Their reporting is good. The writing is good. They source a lot of their reportage very well, and they're the newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, despite the fact that, they're, as far as I've always noticed, it's just they are harshly critical of any regulations, despite the fact that we absolutely must have regulations on business and the wealthy. They're harshly critical of taxing the wealthy. They've been skeptical in at least the editorial page of the climate cataclysm, which has been proven to be true, real, happening. So I don't like the opinions whatsoever presented on the editorial page of your Wall Street Journal. But hey, they're the ones who told us for a fact about I'm spacing. The woman from Silicon Valley who was a complete scam artist, who was a con woman, who had Elizabeth Holmes. They're the ones who, while everyone else was buying hook, line, and sinker the Elizabeth Holmes story, the Wall Street Journal was questioning it, was asking the hard questions, was doing the deep dive, the deep digging into her claims, and they did a tremendous reporting job. So I'm not going to just not trust them, but it's still a great question. Okay, who can you trust? And I don't answer directly. What I respond is what I think we need to do to determine whether, in any particular case, any particular news media is reliable or isn't. So I respond. That's a very tough question, a very good question. And this is something we all have to ask ourselves. Corporate media isn't always lying to you. They are reliable when they relate facts in general. They're pretty reliable. I mean, no one's always reliable, and they are going to generally spin facts just like everyone else. But if they relate facts to you without analysis, in other words, without trying to explain to you what this means or why this happened, I'm more inclined to believe them. If I read in the New York Times that there was an explosion in Ukraine, I believe it. I don't agree with them on the Ukraine war, but if they say that a dam was blown up, I believe it. If they tell me that the highway in Philadelphia, 95, just collapsed southbound, yeah, I'm going to believe it. I mean, until something is proven otherwise. Facts generally are more credible, are more believable. Then if I'm hearing something that's counter to bias, I'm again more likely to believe it, counter to their bias. So if the Wall Street Journal tells me a story that if I believe it, it makes me dislike Republicans more, I'm going to believe it. Because the Wall Street Journal is a Republican newspaper. It's a corporate newspaper. They support the plutocracy. At least the editorial page does. So if they have a story that makes the plutocracy look really bad, I'm more likely to believe it. If the New York Times tells me something that Hillary did that was illegal, I'm likely to believe it because they are clearly a newspaper that supports Hillary Clinton. So I'm using my common sense. I'm looking at, and this is what I think we all need to do. And I also think you look at history and track record. So that's one of the big reasons, by the way. And I'm having disagreements with folks who support continuing to arm Ukraine, who think I shouldn't call Raskin a warmonger because he's announced that he believes wholeheartedly 100% in the Ukraine war. And he's voted for every arms request, every sale of arms, or really just contribution, gift of high-tech weaponry, weapons of death and mass destruction. So when Raskin tells me that, I call him a warmonger. But I'm getting a lot of, there's a lot of pushback. People are saying you shouldn't say that. That's not true. This is our ally. This is our friend. And when I say no, this war is wrong. We shouldn't be involved in it. We shouldn't be supporting Ukraine the way, we shouldn't be. I wouldn't say we shouldn't be involved in it. We should be involved in trying to push for peace. Our promoting ever greater death and destruction is wrong. Our facilitating a situation where we turn cities into rubble, where the war, and I understand people say, well, it's not we, it's Russia, where continuing war, where our failure to try to stop this war leads to a city turned into complete rubble, 80, 90,000 people just rendered homeless or dead, a dam blown up, and people flooded, tens of thousands of people flooded out of their homes, possible nuclear waste leaking because of it. Yeah, I think we should be stopping that war. But the pushback is it's all on Russia. It's all Putin. He launched it. He started it. He's not even amenable to any kind of discussion, to any kind of peace talks. So one of the reasons I reject that narrative, I don't buy it, I don't accept it, is because I look at the track record of the media that claims that to be the case. That claims that this is all Putin's fault, that we have to continue to support Ukraine until the last Ukrainian. And I look at the track record of media that's saying that. And who's saying that? And the New York Times is saying that, and the Washington Post is saying that, and CNN is saying that. Paul Krugman is saying that. And these are people who have gotten it wrong over and over and over again. From stovepiping the lies about weapons of mass destruction that Dick Cheney was telling in 2002, 2003 about Iraq to pave the way and grease the skids, to supporting the bombing of Libya, that led to the killing of Gaddafi, turning that country into a failed state, to endless war in Afghanistan, criticizing the pullout. That is what we have heard from these sources. They have continuously promoted war, and they have been wrong over and over and over again. So my common sense tells me, based on their track record, that they're not telling me the truth. Now, Paul Krugman anticipated that argument and said, hey, I got Iraq right. I was right about Iraq. And I would give you that. I'd also say so was Trump. Trump was saying very early on it was a mistake. He's against this war. So, okay, that's a jump ball maybe. But where you didn't get it right, Krugman, at least as far as I know, is you didn't criticize the endless occupation of Iraq. You didn't say we need to get out of Afghanistan sooner rather than later. You didn't challenge the Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama narrative on Libya. So your track record really ain't that good. And when it comes to foreign policy more generally and trade, you're a Nobel Prize winning economist. You have refused to call out globalism and free unquote trade as incredibly devastating to working class people. And by the way, also a major factor in our wars today. So you don't have a good track record, as a matter of fact. And so I'm not going to likely believe you. There's a lot of factors. I think that, these are complex situations. Obviously, Putin is a bad guy. Obviously, Putin does have territorial ambitions. But we have consistently also instigated and fomented war as well. And we have not, and I'm not saying, and again, my argument isn't that we should just simply pull out, withdraw, not provide any support. My argument is we should be pushing very aggressively for peace. And those who say, well, it's not going to matter, it doesn't make a difference, I think that they're just wrong, and the sources that they rely on are not credible, are not trustworthy. All right, if you want to join me, 240-363-7190. Would love to talk to you. 240-363-7190. And here's what I would say. Why I really, and I thought this was because, again, who do you believe? Who do you believe? I thought this was really interesting. This is a headline from today's New York Times, and why I'm so skeptical. Now, do I read the Times? Of course I do, because there's, tremendous reporting, and they cover so much, and I would be ignorant if I didn't read what they report. But at the same time, I would be ignorant if I believed blindly what they report, or I was inclined to simply believe it unless I had definite proof that they weren't telling the truth. So I thought this was a really interesting blurb here. In Russian, and this is why I perceive the newspaper totally biased, and I'm not going to accept their analysis of the war. In Russian towns pounded by Ukraine, scenes of desperation and defiance. Interviews with Russians on abandoned streets and in crowded shelters suggested the Ukrainian assaults had done little to change Vladimir Putin's calculus. All right. So yes, there's missile launches against Russia. There's attacks on Russian cities close to Ukraine, and it's obviously the war is being brought home to Russia as well. And the point of this, clearly, I don't know how, unless you disagree, let me know, but I don't see how else you can read this article. But Putin's a madman. Putin doesn't care about his people. Putin isn't going to change his mind no matter what. No matter how badly the war goes for Putin, nothing's going to change his mind. And there may be truth to that. Clearly the war has been far more devastating to Ukraine than it has to Russia, but Russia's suffering too, and I think was very ill-advised. Clearly what Putin did. And this, we need to stop it as soon as possible. We, meaning the United States, the global hegemon, along with China, And if not with China, then the U.S. with Western Europe, with NATO, in the UN, we need to have this war stopped, a ceasefire now, and lasting peace as quickly as possible. But I found this headline really intriguing. And again, I think it's when I try to talk to folks and say, well, this is why I believe what I believe, and this is why I don't trust New York Times, and this is why I think you got to use your common sense, I would cite to this headline because I think it manifests very powerfully the dishonesty or let me say a better way to put it. It's not really dishonest exactly. The bias in the New York Times. So they're talking about the destruction of Russia, which has been far less hard hit. I'm not minimizing the suffering by the Russian people, but this is where the damage is done in Ukraine. This is the city that is being destroyed. These are the cities being destroyed in Ukraine. And yet, despite that fact, the headline is about how Russia isn't being moved, how Putin will not change his mind. So to me, that's very emblematic of a biased, manipulative, misrepresentative headline or synopsis of an article. So again, there it is in Russian towns pounded by Ukraine, scenes of desperation and defiance, and that Russians, despite their suffering, aren't seeing any change by Putin. But look at how this could so easily have been written, and I think more accurately written. In Ukrainian towns pounded by Russia, scenes of desperation and defiance. Interviews with Ukrainians on abandoned streets and crowd shelters suggested the Russian assaults had done little to change the West's calculus. Right. So, despite all the damage, the destruction, the death raining down on Ukrainians, it's the West that is refusing to change our calculus. And to me, that's the much more interesting headline that wasn't written. Now, if you're questioning my argument, and by the way, again, one of the challenges that has been made to my, and not just mine, obviously, a lot of other people online, and they take different views, but people like Brianna Joy Gray, I won't say like, Brianna Joy Gray, Jimmy Dore, Katie Halper. We're all critical, harshly critical of this war. I think Sagar and also probably Crystal Ball are against it. So the question then is, well, why are we saying the West won't negotiate? And this was the argument also on Facebook that I didn't present. But the point was made to me, hey, there's been a lot of efforts to have peace talks. And it's Putin. It's Putin who's standing in the way. It's not the West. The West is up for them. Ukraine is up for them. They want peace. They want peace talks. They want to negotiate. So who's telling the truth? Who's right? Who's right? So here's Anthony Blinken. Let me see if I can get this a little bit bigger. I was going to put it at the bottom, but I think maybe it works better this way. So here's Anthony Blinken. Let's play this.
The United States has been working with Ukraine and allies and partners around the world to build consensus around the core elements of a just and lasting peace.
All right, so let me stop it right there. So he's saying, and this was, by the way, I believe June 10. It was earlier. Sorry, it's the 12th. It was a week ago, 8 days ago, I believe, in Helsinki, Finland. So if I'm off by a day or two, I apologize. But it's a very recent speech that Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken gave when he was in Helsinki. And he's saying, hey, we're talking about what a peace would look like. We're already discussing it, which does suggest, does it not? I think it suggests that at least the U.S. is somewhat open to, or, he's trying to say, hey, we're definitely willing to have peace. We definitely want peace. So let's listen to some more of what he says, because I think it's very instructive.
To be clear, the United States welcomes any initiative that helps bring President Putin to the table to engage in meaningful diplomacy.
All right, so that sounds awful good, doesn't it? Any efforts that brings him to the table. But then he added a little caveat, to engage in meaningful diplomacy. That to me is kind of a little bit of a hedge, right? No, we're not prepared to talk to Putin, just period talk, which is what you have to do, right? You just say, we're not going to have any preconditions. We go in, we talk, and we try to figure it out. The first thing, the most important thing, is to stop the killing, stop the bombs, stop blowing up dams and pipelines. That's the most important thing right now. Then we can get to the brass tacks. But that's not where Blinken is. Remember, Blinken is saying first, no, the first thing we're going to do is have Putin come to the table as long as it's to engage in meaningful, as we define it, talks. I got a problem with that.
Support efforts, whether by Brazil, by China, or any other nation, if they help find a way to a just and lasting peace.
Right. So again, we're only welcoming talks if they'll help find a way to a just and lasting peace. So again, more hedging, more just and lasting as we see it, as we determine it, as we define it.
With the principles of the United Nations Charter. Here's what that means. A just and lasting peace must uphold the UN Charter and affirm the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence.
All right, so let me stop it right there. I got no problem with sovereignty. Obviously, I say Ukraine should stay a sovereign state, should be independent. But where I think Blinken tips his hand that he's really not about peace is when he says, and territorial integrity. In other words, we're not going to have any conversations about Donbass. And in fact, we want Crimea back because, Russia's been occupying Crimea for quite some time. We want it back. This isn't just a war about preventing Russia from occupying more territory, even if there are Russian-speaking majority in that area that wants, apparently, as far as we can tell. But we are saying no. We want to roll back the borders. We want to roll back the Russian forces, and that's part of what this war is about, even if Russia instigated. Now, let me just make another point about that. I'm not saying Blinken's wrong, that the U.S. should go into negotiating with Russia and say, hey, you're in Crimea, you really shouldn't be there. You're in you should give back some or all of Donbass. I'm not saying that shouldn't be the U.S.'s and Ukraine's position during the ceasefire discussions. What I'm saying is those shouldn't be a precondition before you talk. You say to Putin, you say to Russia, look, right now, ceasefire, end of the killing. We talk and we talk and we keep talking until this is over. And fine, go in there, play hardball. Draw a line in the sand, but in the end, recognize that we're talking about human life. We're talking about the cities and towns and agricultural areas, and we've got to come to some kind of a settlement that people can live with rather than die from.
A just and lasting peace requires Ukraine's full participation and assent. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine.
All right, so no argument there. But the question should be not nothing without Ukraine without Ukraine. The question should be, what about the U.S.? Does the U.S. get the veto? Does NATO get the veto? Because it sure sounds like that's kind of where Blinken is going with that implication, right? It's not about, we all understand that if there's some question about Ukraine ceding territory, it has to be up to Ukraine. But that's not the issue. The issue is, why is the United States making decisions about this, about what the conditions should look like? Why is the United States going to Finland and imploring them, welcoming them into NATO, knowing this is only going to aggravate a very fraught situation with Russia?
A just and lasting peace must support Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery, with Russia paying its share.
All right, so again, you make statements like that, Russia's going to have to pay. If you don't, you make it impossible, really, to have a conversation. Because Putin's going to be like, no, I'm not going to pay. That doesn't mean he won't agree to down the road. But he's like, well, wait a second. Why should I pay? I've already won a lot of territory. Why should I help reconstruct? They didn't have to fight. They didn't have to, take all this weaponry and kill all these Russians. Why should I be the one? I'm not saying Putin's right. I'm saying you don't lay down these kinds of conditions before you have a conversation. If you do, you're saying we don't want to have a conversation. We don't want peace. That's precisely what Anthony Blinken is doing here. And it's extremely problematic, obviously.
A just and lasting peace must address both accountability and reconciliation. A just and lasting peace can open a pathway to sanctions relief connected to concrete actions, especially military withdrawal. A just and lasting peace must end Russia's war of aggression. Now,
Right. I mean, of course, you can't have peace without an end to the war, right? I mean, that's clear. It's kind of a throwaway. It's clear, as Blinken continues, that the U.S. is not interested. I'm not saying we're not interested in a just and lasting peace. What we're saying is what he's saying is we're not interested in having a ceasefire. We're not interested in ending the hostilities, in cessation of hostilities, unless Russia does exactly what we want. That's not that. And what that means is you're really not interested in ceasing hostilities. It means you are interested in ending, an endless war.
coming weeks and months, some countries will call for a ceasefire. And on the surface, that sounds sensible, attractive even. After all,
Well, attractive even. Yes, I would say attractive.
who doesn't want warring parties to lay down their arms?
I'll tell you who doesn't. The people who are selling the arms. The people who are manufacturing the arms and making billions of dollars doing so. That's who. Very simply. In this case, that's who. Lockheed Martin, Palantir, the people who are funding many of our politicians, who contribute to people like Adam Schiff, or I shouldn't say like, who contribute to Adam Schiff, Jamie Raskin, Rachel Maddow. That's who doesn't want arms to be laid down.
Who doesn't want the killing to stop? But a ceasefire that simply freezes current lines in place and enables Putin to consolidate control over the territory he seized and then rest, rearm, and reattack, that is not a just and lasting peace. It's a Potemkin peace. It would legitimize.
All right, that's a very, very frustrating and upsetting statement by Blinken. What he's saying is, no, we can't have a ceasefire. We can't stop the killing. We have to sacrifice more. We have to sacrifice more Ukrainians because otherwise it'll strengthen Putin. That's crazy talk, frankly. The war is crushing Ukraine, even to a greater degree than it is crushing Russia. That's a crazy thing for him to say. It makes sense if you don't want peace, right? Because I can tell you, once there's a ceasefire, the pressure is going to be ever greater to come to some sort of an agreement, which I would welcome. But what Blinken is saying is, oh, no, we can't have a ceasefire. We can't have negotiations because what? It'll help Putin more than it'll help the country that's just been ravaged, devastated. And we understand from our media the people of Ukraine being subject to horrible criminal activity by Russians. And yet somehow, if we stop the hostilities, that's going to be good for Russia, but not Ukraine. It just isn't. Is that so? This is the question. You know, people ask me, well, why believe, I don't know, Aaron Mate, Max Blumenthal, when they're saying this war's a mistake? Why not believe the New York Times and Washington Post? And that's why. I just told you. Because it's clear that the leadership in the West isn't interested in peace. They're not trying. They're not suing for peace. They're not trying to reduce hostility. They're not trying to stop it. And that's what I want. I just want people not to die. All right. Want to get to one more story. I was really interested in this, by the way, in this story. 240, by the way, 363-7190. Love to talk to you. 240-363-7190. Need those calls. Come on. And by the way, if you do call, I know we had a problem before where some people were calling and I didn't answer. I think I've got that resolved. I hope I have it resolved. If you do call, by the way, and you get to me, or you don't hear from me, I'm sorry. If you call and you don't hear from me, or I don't answer the call, tell me, text, email, whatever, so I know that you did try to reach me and you didn't. I think that's what I'm trying to say here. Because I think I've got the system set up so that if you do call, hear the little chime, and then I can put you on. That's the goal. 240-363-7190. All right. One more story. I was really interested in this, probably because I'm a live streamer. And the New York Times Magazine did an interesting article about this guy. This guy, number one American live streamer. Apparently there are a couple there's somebody in India who has more views per video than Mr. Beast. And I don't think I've ever watched a Mr. Beast video. I thought this was an interesting question. He's doing all these wonderful altruistic things, absurd acts of altruism. Why do so many people think he's evil? And I'm going to answer that in a little bit. I think there's a couple reasons. But I also just wanted to, again, point out why I find so often the New York Times so irritating, condescending, wrong. So the article's about this guy, Mr. Beast. And when I read this online, when I started reading this article, I was like, wow, I wouldn't have said that. I wouldn't write that. I don't like that. Really, that's what you're going to say about, that's how you describe someone? And I think it kind of shows you how the New York Times is not an ally, right? The New York Times is not about trying to make things better for poor, struggling, and working people. Not that that should necessarily be its goal. I mean, its goal is all the news that's fit to print. But I think what the New York Times does, and I think you see it in this quote here, and I'm just going to show the whole screen because it's kind of small print, is it's actually doing the opposite of trying to make things better for poor, struggling, and working people. It's trying to make things worse. It's aggravating tensions. So I highlighted this one part because it just jumped out at me. Why would you ever write this? And remember, we talk about functionalism. Why? What function does this serve? Newspaper of record, most powerful newspaper in the world. Why would you write something like this? To describe Mr. Beast, if you created an average of the faces of all 25-year-old white North Carolinians, you would probably end up with something like Donaldson's, like Mr. Beast. Now, I have zero idea what that means. I really don't. I mean, I didn't go look at Mr. Beast's face. Do you have any idea what the average, does that create any image in your mind what the average of all 25-year-old white North Carolinian faces looks like? Do 25-year-old white North Carolinians look different than 25-year-old white Vermonters or Californians? I mean, is there something about... I'm asking because I have no freaking clue. I'm just trying to understand why. I mean, it doesn't provoke or evoke any image in my mind. I've been to North Carolina. It's a very diverse state. I've been all over the state. Been to the Asheville, right on the Tennessee line. Duke. University of North Carolina. Been to the Outer Banks, the easternmost part of North Carolina. I don't remember there being a particular North Carolina face. And if you think about, how I previously, when I was going over the New York Times and I provided this, I changed the headline, say this just shows you how ridiculous the New York Times headline is, where they're trying to present Putin as the one who's refusing to take into account the reality of the harm that the war is doing to Russia. And I say, hey, the headline makes more sense if you point out how the West is ignoring the harm that this war is doing to Ukraine, or doesn't care. But I think you could make the argument here, well, what if they had written in the New York Times, if you create an average of the face of all 25-year-old black North Carolinians? They would never write that. It would be rightly seen as, I think, maybe not necessarily racist, but incredibly racially insensitive, as though there's some kind of a standard African-American North Carolina face. So I'm trying to understand, why would they do this? What were they thinking? It does strike me as incredibly condescending towards white North Carolinians. And I kind of hope the response is that white North Carolinians stop subscribing to the New York Times. And it's all one final point. And Mr. Beast, this guy Donaldson, his first name, is a man. He is, as far as I know, he is a cisgender male. Does his face look like a 25-year-old white North Carolinian woman's face? It's just a crazy, stupid passage that, to me, calls into question just about everything that the New York Times is trying to do. Because I do think it's divisive, it's racially divisive, it's condescending, and it, again, makes it tougher for poor, struggling, and working people to unite. It divides people. So I just want to talk a little bit more about this article, because as much as that was a load of crap, nevertheless, this is kind of an interesting little quote here about why some people don't like Mr. Beast. What's the problem with Mr. Beast? And what he does, and what he even does. And I've never watched his video. I still haven't. I guess I should. I guess I shouldn't talk about his videos without watching them. But I really don't care about his videos. They're meaningless to me. I care about the way it's covered by the New York Times. So here's what he does. He did a show where he gave a random homeless person $10,000. He left, I guess he bought an island. He's so rich because he's got 140 million people watching his videos every time. So I figured, if you have 1,000 people watching your videos, maybe you got $1,000 a year. So if you got 144 million people watching your videos, do you get 144 million? Dollars a year? Maybe. I mean, he's making many, many millions of dollars. That's how much money this guy's making, many, many millions of dollars every year from his videos. And the criticism is that because he does these stunts, like he gave a waitress a real gold bar, and then he, videotaped all of it and then live streamed it or whatever he did with it. The criticism is his generosity is more calculated than heartfelt. Well, I'm sure there's truth to that. But is that a legitimate criticism? I mean, if he's doing good, if people are better off, if he's helping people, then isn't that what we should focus on rather than if he's calculating, if he's doing it to benefit himself? Isn't what really matters whether what he's doing is a good thing, is leading to, and by the way, sorry to jump there, I didn't think that was going to happen. That's the question to ask. Is he doing good? And I'm sure he is. The people who are getting those $80,000 islands or $800,000 islands and gold bars, yeah, they're pretty happy about it. But here's the problem. And that's why I think, honestly, I'll put put myself ahead of Mr. Beast, although I don't have any, I don't have 1/1,000,000th of the number of viewers he has. I'm trying to change society so that everyone has enough and nobody has too much. Everyone can live a decent life. Mr. Beast is finding a few people who aren't doing well and making life better for them. But he's not changing the basic injustice, the basic inequality. In fact, he could arguably be making things worse, or at least preventing a coalition forming that will fight for true economic justice for all, because some people might say, hey, we don't need to do anything. There's Mr. Beast out there giving people islands and gold bars. So that's the solution. I mean, I have viewers who would say that. Well, if you really want to make things better, why aren't you more like Mr. Beast? Because even this guy who may be making, I don't know if he makes $100 million, but maybe making $40, $50 million as a YouTube host a year, can't make a dent in poverty rates. In fact, one of the arguments I've heard, which is not true, is that if we raise taxes on the wealthy to a much higher degree, if we have very, very high top marginal tax rates, it won't impact on poverty. No, it will. It will. And government policies and programs can pretty much eliminate poverty. And we know that because there are some countries that have virtually zero poverty rates. But just Mr. Beast alone can't. Obviously, I'm not in his league. I can't. The way we address these societal dysfunctions and worse, pathologies, morbidities, is together demanding that everyone have enough and nobody has too much. All right, I had one more story I was going to try to get to, but I've gone through pretty much the whole hour, and I'm not going to go to this next one. Maybe we'll get to it tomorrow. This is a settlement JP Chase reached with some of the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. And that story, I haven't really talked much about it, but it clearly shows, it proves the rot, the corrupt rot at the heart of the American capitalist state. We must change that dynamic so everyone has enough and nobody has too much. And if you want to argue what is enough and what is too much, we can always have that conversation. I'll be back tomorrow.